With that, according to my clock, it is 2 o'clock, and we like to be respectful of your time and get started. Again, please remember to mute your phones. But with that, we'll get started. Today we have 2 speakers, or 2 presentations that we'd like to present. First is Louis Cassada, who is our program manager responsible for managing the true-up program as well as our carrier cost recovery and things like that. And he's going to go over the basics of the 2017 true-up process. We did kick that off a few days ago on July 1st, and it is due by September 1st, I believe 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And this is one of those mandatory reports for the board, so if you do not provide it, you would be ineligible for grant in fiscal 2019. So it's very important that you do submit the report and you do it on time. So again, if you have any questions for Louis as we go through, please interrupt and ask. We want to make sure that you get the report done, get it in on time, and please, 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 if you can, get it in early. Earlier the better. Waiting until the last day is, causes consternation both for you and for us. So we want to make sure we have time to review it and that you turn in a good report. And then second, we'll have Dorothy Spears-Dean talking about the PSAP grant program for fiscal 19, which the grant window opened July 1st as well. And it was kind of late that the board approved the grant guidelines. It wasn't until late in June before we were able to get a quorum of the board to approve them, but they are now approved, and there are several new things in the grant program this year that we want to make sure we review and that you understand on how to make the submission, that you understand the GIS assessment that goes along with it, that determines eligibility for GIS grants and so on. So please, again, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt and ask those questions. But otherwise, please mute your phones, and we will proceed. So, Louis, I turn it over to you.
Okay. Hey, I'm Louis Cassada, and like Steve said, I'm here today to go over the FY17 true-up process. We've produced all the true-up reports for the PSAPs, and I believe all the regional coordinators have emailed out the forms to their local PSAP contacts. It was just a 2-page document. The first page is an informational and contact sheet. The second page is the form that needs to be filled out and sent back to us. And if you can go to the next slide, Dorothy. And the top half of the second page is what you're looking at now. And like Steve already said, these forms are due back to us 5 o'clock on September 1st. And just try and, like Steve just said, please try and get them in early. That's going into a holiday weekend and things, people are taking off, and we just want to make sure we get everybody's forms in and that everybody stays eligible for grants. So for the past several years, we've asked PSAPs just to provide us with the 3 numbers that you see on the sheet: the total incoming 911 calls received, total wireless 911 calls received, and total personnel costs for the PSAP. And just what I have here, I filled in some of the numbers just for illustrative purposes. Your form will be filled out with your 2016 numbers that you submitted last year, and then what we're looking for is what is in the FY2017 column. So all you need to do is fill in those 3 numbers and send it back to the RCs. Let's see. You can go to the next slide, Dorothy. What we're looking for the call numbers, and I think the Steve and the regional coordinators wanted me to just get this out here first in case anybody's got any questions, is the total wireless calls and the total incoming calls. You've got the option now to generate your 12-month report with either your native MIS or your ECATs. And what we would like to see is a 12-month report. So if you've only had your ECATs working for a couple months, you can send in that information as well, but we want to see a consistent 12-month report. So if you do send in ECATs, we want to see the class of service, or if you send in your native MIS, we would like to see the trunk report. If there are any discrepancies between those two reports where the numbers are out of line or don't seem like they line up, our ISP staff is going to assist with you in resolving them. The important thing is that the total calls number is what is going to be most important. And I think Steve might touch on that just for a second with the upcoming formula change, that it's the recommendation of the funding committee that we are going to be looking at just total calls for the next iteration of the 911 funding formula and not so much wireless calls. But does anybody have any questions on that?
Hey, Louis, this is Steve. I'll just go ahead and interject right now. We wrestled with this issue of which report. For many years, most PSAPs have been submitting a trunk report, and the trunk report is split up by those trunks that we identify as wireline trunks and those trunks that we identify as wireless. And we've known for years that that's not really indicative of the type of call that's received. Calls such as voice over IP typically come in on the wireless trunks. And clearly they're not necessarily wireless, or they're not wireless, they're the voice over IP, which are more like wireline. So, it's not really a good split between the two. Class of service is better, but the class of service report, there are some that don't have a class of service. So we're still researching to figure out, what is there. And that's why initially we said if you're doing an ECAS report, we'd prefer you to do the class of service report. But we recognize that's not available for everyone. So for this year, submit the reports that you have. We'd like you to be consistent if you can. So if you do a trunk report from your native, do a trunk report from ECATs if that's what you have for the latter part of the year. And work with your regional coordinator to try and get the best data that we can. We realize that distinction between wireline and wireless may not be perfect. And it's okay because, as Louis said, the funding formula for the future that the funding committee is recommending to the board, it looks at total calls, not the wireless calls. And what we've been able to distill from most native call handling or call MISs and from ECATs is those numbers pretty much match in total calls. And when you run a class of service report and a trunk report, the totals match. So it shouldn't impact. But we have had some PSAPs who ran a class of service report and it said that they had maybe 70% wireless calls, but if they ran the trunk report, the wireless trunks took 80% of the calls, and they were worried that that would somehow impact their funding, the difference. So it shouldn't. Report what you have. We do need 12 months worth of data so that we have the complete year, and just do the best you can at figuring out which one of those two reports works out best for you. And again, we'd like it to be consistent. If you do trunk report for the whole year. If you do class of service, do class of service for the whole year. Mixing apples and oranges would be more confusing. So, and any questions about that? Like I said, we've wrestled with that one ourselves as to how to recommend you do those reports. But this is the best we've been able to come up with. Any questions? Not Louis, I'll turn it back over to you. Sounds like somebody may have put us on the hold with the beep beeps there, but
yeah. Okay.
Hopefully.
All right. Yeah, Dorothy, if you can go to the next page. All right. Now what I'm showing you is just an example of a custom report that a large PSAP has been sending in for the last several years, and this is all we really need from every PSAP. It's just a one-page system-generated summary report. Now, this report is by month, but it's got the total column, so an annual report is fine as well. We don't need the pages and pages and pages of call records, but if you send them in, we'll take them. And I'll just touch on a couple things in this report. They break out their E911 trunks and their wireless trunks, and then they have a few what they call other 911, and it's just simple and easy to read, and the totals are easy to add up. And then one other thing that is on this report and why I chose it is in the definitions on the true-up form. It goes into discussing abandoned calls. And if you count abandoned calls for your total 911 call number, you also have to include them in your wireless total. And at the bottom of this report, you can see that they've got I hope everybody can see it, but they've got the 140,000 total calls, and they have 15,000 abandoned calls, and they can break that out further into abandoned wireless. So they add up their abandoned wireless with their wireless calls and abandoned total with their 911 calls answered to get their numbers. And this is all we need. This is one of the top 5 PSAPs in the state, and just a one-page report that clearly breaks everything out is all we need. And this is fine. It's been working for years for us. All right, the next page, Dorothy. Yeah, all right. And then same PSAP I just showed you the call records for. This is what they send in for their personnel cost total. It's just basically just a one-page general ledger summary sheet. It shows the salaries and wages, the cash awards, and the minimum staffing pay. This is perfectly fine. This is all we really need. What some PSAPs do is they will actually send in the biweekly statements for each call taker and dispatcher. So there'll be 24 numbers for each call taker and dispatcher that we have to go back and add up and make sure the totals are added correctly, and that can be challenging. So no matter the size of your PSAP, this report is perfectly fine, and this is what we're looking for. Next page, Dorothy. Now, what we're asking for this year, kind of like a point of emphasis, is the same PSAP. Now, I've deleted some information on this page, so if you're wondering why the numbers look a little funny, I've just deleted some of the salary information. But the same PSAP sends in this summary calculation sheet. So the number that's on their general ledger was the $3.6 million. They perform the calculations, and I'll just read it in case it's not clear on your end, but their total includes a director's salary, an automation analyst, a quality assurance coordinator, chief of admin services and training, and the training facilitator. The total salaries were reduced by a director, an ops manager, automation coordinator, and admin secretary who are not call takers or dispatchers. So this is kind of just show your work. Just a summary sheet, just a one-pager that just shows how you add up your totals for the allowable personnel costs is what we're looking for. This just makes us able to process and double-check and triple-check the true-up numbers a whole lot faster. I think each regional coordinator has 20, 25 PSAPs, and then we just want to be able to process these quickly and just not be able to add up the numbers and know how you're adding them up and just minimize the amount of back and forth we have between the RCs and the PSAPs and myself. All right, next page. This is an additional personnel cost example. I'd say about 80 out of the 120 PSAPs send in a general ledger or an expenditure summary report that looks just like this. And what I just want to highlight from this sheet are just a couple points. The first thing, when you run your report, this happens every year, 5 or 6 PSAPs just run the wrong date range. So double check the date range, make sure it's for last fiscal year. The second most common issue is that people will fill in the budget amount on their true-up form instead of the year-to-date actual amount. We want the year-to-date actual amount. And then what counts for the true-up are what we call the paycheck items or the W-2 items, what shows up on the employee's paycheck or pay statement. It's the salaries and wages, overtime and part-time, and on the true-up form we called it one-time salary adjustment. That's bonuses. So if a bonus would show up on the W-2, that counts. What doesn't count are things like training or books, or people always try and put uniforms in here. What clearly does not count are the employer-paid items, the employer's share of Social Security, FICA, retirement, hospitalization, life insurance, or workman's comp. Those in the second second set of blue boxes down, those items do not count. So we just want the paycheck items basically in the total personnel cost number. And next page, Dorothy. And that's basically it for the true-up summary. Our preference, like Steve said, is to have the same type of call report that covers the entire year, a 12-month report, whether it's ECATS or MIS, but whatever works best for you. Please have a summary sheet that shows how your numbers are added up. If it's not just crystal clear in the general ledger itself, if you make any adjustments, show how you made those adjustments. And Excel is fine. A lot of folks just will photocopy accounting machine tape, send that in. That's fine. Don't wait until the last minute, especially since we're coming up on a holiday. The timely completion of the true-up is a requirement for participation in the grant program. So the PSAP grant program is one of the simplest grant programs out there for localities, and we don't want anybody to be ineligible for the grant program. And if you have any questions, contact your regional coordinator, and that would be, here are the regional coordinators. I think the folks in Region 3 know Stephanie McGuffin, and who is backing her up for the PSAPs in those regions. So if you have any questions, call your regional coordinator, send them an email, or myself or anybody here in Chester. And with that, I think that's it. Does anybody have any questions? It's just 3 numbers, and that's what we're looking for. Just that amount of backup is all we really need. So you can have one call report page, one general ledger accounting page, and a summary sheet, and that's fine. Just one other thing I'll mention is maybe 4 or 5 PSAPs have difficulty in producing the financial documents. So what we will also accept in place of that is a signed letter from somebody in your locality, like a town manager or city manager, that'll say, yes, our personnel costs for this fiscal year were $250,000, and if it's signed on their letterhead, we will accept that as well.
Thank you, Louis. Any questions for Louis?
Hey, Steve, this is Stephanie. Can I make a comment?
Please.
So I just wanted to say that we certainly will accept a report out of your call accounting that shows all 12 months. But please remember, as the year goes on, to look at your systems at least once a month, run the reports, make sure it's functioning like it should be. Don't wait until true-up time just to run the one yearly report. You know, remember to get in there and use your systems, whether it's ECATS or your native system, whatever you're most comfortable with, and run reports and make sure it's collecting the data and doing what it should be.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's a very good point. We've recommended for years that you run them monthly and put them in the file drawer, because we do have the rule that if you get to the end of the year and it stopped working halfway through and you didn't catch it, you will most likely be declared ineligible for the next year's grant cycle. Now, if you catch it right away, even if it takes 6 months to fix, and we've had a couple like that, but you notified us within 30 days or so of the error occurring, those PSAPs have all been held harmless and as a result did not become ineligible for funding. So it's really making sure you're capturing the data, running the report monthly so that you have them should the system fail. We've had a few where the system failed and they got it restored right away, but the old data was lost. So they lost the first 6 months of the year because the system crashed and they had no backup. So if you run the report monthly, at the most, you'll lose a month. And again, as long as you let us know about that right away, get notification, then no harm, no foul, you can extrapolate that extra month. Any other questions, comments? You have another opportunity at the end, but I'll go ahead then and turn it over to Dorothy to talk about the fiscal 19 grant process that window just opened July 1st. Go ahead, Dorothy.
Thanks, Steve. What I'd like to cover during my presentation is to give everyone a brief review of the 19 guidelines and the applications, and then to focus on the NG911 data cleanup projects and the GIS readiness reports. The second item is related to the 19 guidelines. The Commonwealth is shifting from planning for to implementing NG911. So to address NG911 planning needs, a new programmatic area has been created within the PSAP grant program. And this programmatic area is the NG911 grant program. The 19 guidelines focus on the recommended changes to the grant program set by the board to facilitate the deployment of NG911. And as Steve mentioned earlier, the 19 guidelines were approved by the board in late June, on June 28th, to be specific. And the grant program will now be used almost exclusively to support one-time NG911 transition costs. You see these costs here: one-time ESINet setup, GIS data prep, and transitioning the PSAPs from the selective routers to the ESINet. There will also be a second programmatic area in the 19 guidelines. This is the PSAP education program, and this program will have a dedicated funding amount of $500,000. If you'll recall from the previous year, there's an option for PSAPs to participate individually and then also as part of regional projects. So both of those two items will remain in the 19 guidelines. And both the NG911 and PSAP education program applications are available from the ISP website. You can get a copy on the PSAP grant program webpage. Just look under the forms and reports section. In the 19 guidelines, grants are tied primarily to NG911 implementation needs. We have a very good idea of the primary one-time transition cost, so it makes sense to make this investment now. Once a procurement decision is made and we know the outcome of our legislation, additional needs may arise and can be addressed in subsequent guideline documents. So for this reason, the 19 guidelines serves as a bridge year. The grant application cycle opened on July 1st. This is before any statewide ESINet procurement decision has been made. The board will also be approving 19 awards in January of 18, and this is before the outcome of their 18 legislative agenda is known. So for these two reasons, the 19 guidelines need to stand independent of any ESINet procurement decision or legislation. We're looking at funding differently than in the past. We're focusing on providing baseline capability during the implementation period for NG911 as opposed to yearly funding. During the NG911 implementation years, the guidelines will describe a program that is focused on the entire implementation period rather than a yearly grant program. But again, 19 is a bridge year. So in 19, we will have funding limited to the following NG911 grant program priorities. Call handling equipment, $200,000 is available to PSAPs participating in a shared services project. $150,000 would be available to a PSAP that wishes to participate in an individual call handling equipment project. There is full funding for allowable GIS data cleanup projects that meet the criteria and thresholds established by the board at their June 28th meeting. And I'll be spending the remainder of the presentation talking about the GIS data cleanup projects, the readiness reports, and the criteria and thresholds for those. $75,000 for CAD, $25,000 for mapping. These two items are only going to be available in fiscal year 19, and then $500,000 for each initial fiscal consolidation project. There is no funding for other items included in the guidelines from previous years. Only non-vendor supported equipment is eligible for funding. The concept of tiers from previous grant years has been removed. And we've received a couple of questions from the PSAP community regarding text to 911, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned on today's presentation that text to 911 is eligible for funding as a call handling equipment grant. So moving on to NG911 GIS. The regional coordinators will be providing their localities with GIS readiness reports. The fiscal year 19 guidelines provide funding to enable PSAPs to undertake allowable NG911 GIS data cleanup projects. And the goal in this year is to achieve a baseline level of readiness during the bridge year. As part of the 19 PSAP grant program, there is a continued focus on NG911 GIS data preparation. And as I've already mentioned, the board on June 28th established criteria and the related thresholds for that criteria for NG911 data cleanup projects. The readiness report that will be distributed by the regional coordinators. This report focuses on key areas of your data that must be correct in order for your data to be ready to move into an NG911 system, and should be used to address areas, and you should use this report to focus on the areas that need attention. These reports are based on previously provided MSAC-ALI GIS analysis results from 2016 and 2017. For some PSAPs, it may be that they can address issues identified in this report locally. For others, it may be to submit a grant. The RCs, the regional coordinators, can certainly help the PSAP and GIS local governments communities determine next steps. But my primary message to you today related to the readiness reports and NG911 GIS data cleanup projects is that a grant is an option, but it's not the only option. For example, in your report, you may find that the addition of a single address point may fix several problems and increase match rates. For something that can be addressed with a relatively small amount of time with local personnel, it really doesn't make sense to try to make the project more involved and submit a request for a grant. So be expecting the readiness reports. They're going to start going out after the webinar. And if you have questions regarding the readiness report and how it relates to the PSAP grant program and the 19 guidelines, your regional coordinator is a source of assistance for you to help you in that endeavor. So to talk about the specific criteria and thresholds, 11 focus areas have been identified for NG911 GIS data cleanup projects, and these focus areas are based on the 4 data sets you see here: address points, road centerline, address overlap, and address duplicates. The amount of a discrepancy that there is between the report and the match rate will be used to determine grant eligibility. So moving on to the specific focus areas. As I mentioned, there are 11. And what and this slide lists 4 focus areas that are related to ALI automatic location identification. And these focus areas compare ALI to address points in 4 different ways. Address points with spelling incorrect, RCL and with spelling incorrect, and funding for localities is available for localities that do not meet the 98% threshold or match rates. The next set of focus areas are related to RCL. These areas are comparison to duplicate address ranges, left side overlapping address ranges, right side overlapping address ranges, and then the last focus area is with non-standard street name attributes. Funding for localities is available for these focus areas that do not meet the 99% threshold or match rate. And moving on to the last set of focus areas, these are related to address points. The 3 specific areas are address point is a duplicate and there is no street name or number. Address point does not geocode to the RCL, or address point or RCL street name mismatch. Funding for localities is available that does not meet either the 98 or 99% threshold or match rate, but this is dependent on the focus area. And that is a very quick overview of the 19 guidelines. Does anybody have any questions about the guidelines, about the GIS readiness reports, or how they relate, or how these reports relate to the 19 guidelines? Is anybody still out there?
Yes, I have another question, Dorothy. This is Alita. Will these slides be made available, particularly the True Up slides, or are they on the site? If they are, I'm unable to locate them.
Alita, we certainly will make the slides available to you. At the moment, we have a content freeze, so we'll be able to update the website soon, but just not immediately after the webinar. So what I will do is make the slides available to the regional coordinators so they can distribute them to their constituents.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other questions or comments?
All right. Well, this is Steve. Thank you, Dorothy. Are there any other last questions about either the true-up process or the grant process? You know, we realize fiscal 19's grant process is a little different. You know, we're using that GIS assessment report to determine eligibility for GIS grants. Last year, if you recall, we had a number of proposals that were very involved in doing GIS data update, and we weren't really sure how to evaluate them and determine which ones were necessary and which ones weren't. So we went to this assessment report as a way of being able to determine how good or bad GIS data was based on the existing 911 database. So we know it's not perfect, but I think it gives us a very good start for this year in looking at it. Like Dorothy said, not everyone will need to hire a consultant to fix the problems. We found some localities that It would only take a couple addresses being added as address points to solve the address point to alley match rate and things like that. And of course, we have some resources here at VITA that we can help with as well. But if you have any questions at all, as Dorothy said, your regional coordinator is a wealth of information and has access to your report, assessment report, and also has access to your ECATS data, so they can get in there and help you take a look at something if it just doesn't look great or if you're not sure. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? I know you never complain when we wrap up early, but we want to make sure that if you have any questions, that we answer them.
Steve,
all right, if not, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Other than the agencies that were the pilot for ECATS, there aren't any jurisdictions in the state that have had ECATS for a year yet, correct?
That is correct. That is correct. So
basically, the majority of the state still needs to use their native MIS for this year, and next year we can start with ECATS.
Correct. There were some localities that were replacing their call handling equipment during the year and did not buy the new version of it that went with their call handling equipment, and decided to rely on ECATS. So there might be some people that do 6 months worth of their native and 6 months of ECATS, and that's fine. Again, we'd like to have the reports be the same type of report, either both trunk or both call class of service or something like that, so you're not trying to compare two different things. But again, you can work with your regional coordinator on that. So, but you are correct that most localities can just run 12 months out of their legacy or native call accounting system and submit that report just like you always have. Next year, we're really hopeful that we won't even need to make the request, that we'll just be able to pull the data. Because if the board moves forward with the funding formula being recommended by the funding committee, we won't need personnel cost anymore. The only thing we'll need is call count, total call count, and that in population. So we'll be able to pull that ourselves from the ECATS system statewide and for each PSAP. So hopefully this will be the last time you have to do it. I underline the word hopefully. There were a couple PSAPs that have not converted over to ECATS yet because they're implementing new call handling systems and very quickly or very soon in this new year. So we may have to work with them to get a few missing months, but I believe it's only 4 out of 119. Any last questions? All right, thank you all for participating. We do have in 2 weeks another webinar Wednesday scheduled. That one we will be talking about the funding formula and the recommendation from the funding committee. We want to make sure everyone understands what the impact is of that funding formula, because it will have a dramatic impact on some PSAPs. The funding will either increase greatly or decrease greatly for some localities. Some it's a moderate change, but for some it's a very significant. We're talking 20 to 30% change. So we want to make sure everybody's aware of that, because as soon as the board approves this in September at their September meeting, if they approve it, we're going to be sending out the revenue projections for fiscal 19, because this would go into effect July 1st of 2018, which is the start of fiscal 19. And we want to make sure you have the updated projections for your budget, local budget process, because you may have a windfall or you may have a shortfall in the funding that you've historically received. So this is the first recalculation in 5 years. This is a significant change, so please pay attention to it when the spreadsheet comes out and is available for review. And I believe it's on our website already from the work of the funding committee. Please take a look at it and participate in the webinar. We want your feedback, and the board wants your feedback before they make a decision in September. So, and again, if I will jump to the punchline of that webinar for you, and that is, if you don't like it because of the impact it has on your locality, if not that, then what? this is something that we go through every couple of years talking about the funding formula, and there's always going to be winners and losers. And what the funding committee has come up with, they feel is fair and appropriate. But if it isn't, then what is fair and appropriate? What is the right answer? And that's the real burning question that we have to answer, because we have to implement something by July 1st of next year. So with that, that's something to look forward to. That is in 2 weeks at 2 o'clock. If you haven't gotten the announcement, look on our website. It's there. Or let your RC know and they can forward it to you. And otherwise, have a great rest of the day, and look forward to providing future webinars for you. Thank you.